Listen up, because what I'm about to tell you will completely change how we understand the power of the FIA. Internal documents have been leaked explaining why Max Verstappen walked free after cutting the track at the Mexican GP, while Lewis Hamilton was penalized with a 10-second penalty that ruined his race. And worst of all, the FIA's official reason contradicts its own regulations. Stay tuned, because you're about to understand the truth. They try to hide behind the biggest regulatory scandal of the season. Stay until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The 2025 Mexican Grand Prix was a bombshell, not only because of the battle between Ferrari and Red Bull, but also because of a widespread feeling that the FIA once again applied a double standard. Hamilton, after a spectacular fight with Verstappen, ended up being the only one penalized. Social media, forums, and even the experts themselves agreed on one thing: the rules weren't the same for everyone. In the hours that followed, the stewards' documents, the infamous Doc 37 and Doc 38, were leaked, and that's where it all began. For the first time, it became clear why one driver was penalized and the other wasn't, and why it made absolutely no sense. The 2025 Mexican Grand Prix will go down in history not only for the intensity of the race, but for a moment that sparked a global firestorm. On lap 6, two of the greatest drivers of this era, Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, found themselves in a head-to-head battle that encapsulated all the pent-up tension of the championship. The sequence began at turn 1, when Verstappen pushed his Red Bull to the limit, attacking down the inside with characteristic aggression that left Hamilton with no room to react. Contact was inevitable, the wheels touched, and the number 44 Ferrari was forced slightly off the apex. The stewards initially ruled it a racing incident, deeming the Red Bull's front axle perfectly aligned to allow for the racing line. However, that analysis was merely the first layer of a much deeper conflict. What transpired in the following corners changed the course of the Grand Prix and ignited the most heated debate of the season. Exiting turn 1, Verstappen lost traction, ran wide into turn 2, and ended up completely off the track, all four wheels on the grass. For a few brief seconds, the crowd held its breath. Cameras showed the four-time Formula One world champion struggling to maintain control as Hamilton's Ferrari closed in dangerously on the inside. In theory, according to FIA regulations, when a driver goes off the track and rejoins while maintaining position, they must give it back if they gain a lasting advantage. However, this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The stewards reviewed the telemetry and concluded that Verstappen did not deserve a penalty. They argued that, although he cut the track, the data showed he didn't accelerate fully as quickly as on previous laps, interpreting that difference as a loss of time rather than a gain in position. In short, the FIA considered that his mistake had cost him more than it had benefited him. Entering turn 4, Hamilton launched his attack with determination. It was an aggressive, almost desperate maneuver, but also a display of his characteristic competitive hunger. He positioned himself on the outside, looking to exploit the Ferrari's superior traction on the corner exit. Verstappen, meanwhile, held his inside line, closing the gap with surgical precision. The battle was down to the millimeter, two champions measured in centimeters. Hamilton locked his right front wheel, lost grip, and was forced to continue straight on towards the runoff area. Up to that point, the maneuver was nothing out of the ordinary. Any driver who brakes too late uses the runoff area, reduces speed, and rejoins safely. But the crucial detail was how he did it. Instead of following the route marked by the race director's yellow line, which requires a longer path to rejoin safely, Hamilton cut straight onto the grass, cutting towards turn 5 and rejoining just ahead of Verstappen and the young Oliver Behrman, who had been caught up in the chaos. That decision, made in an instant, was interpreted by the FIA as a serious infraction. The FIA issued its initial ruling through Document 37. In it, the stewards acknowledged that Hamilton was traveling at too high a speed to follow the route prescribed by the race director. They stated that, given the circumstances, the driver had a justifiable reason for not complying with the instruction. In short, they exonerated him for that part of the incident, understanding that the maneuver had been the result of a braking error and not a deliberate decision. Up to that point, it seemed the Briton would escape any penalty. However, minutes later, everything changed with the publication of Document 38. In this second review, The FIA evaluated not the procedure, but the outcome of the maneuver. According to the report, by cutting the corner and rejoining directly in front of Verstappen, Hamilton had gained a lasting advantage. And most importantly, he did not give the position back. That was the key that determined his fate. The standard penalty for this type of situation is 10 seconds, and the stewards decided to apply it. In that context, leaks began to circulate about the FIA's internal post-race meeting. It was said that some stewards privately admitted that the penalty might have been a mistake, but that reversing it would have damaged the image of authority of the organization. In other words, they preferred to maintain an inconsistent decision rather than admit a mistake. That revelation was like fuel for a fire that was already consuming the institution. In a statement, the FIA asserted that each incident is assessed within its context and based on the information available at the time. With that phrase, the governing body implicitly acknowledged that there is no uniform criterion. In other words, each case can have a different interpretation depending on the circumstances. This ambiguity highlighted the structural gap facing modern Formula One. The rules exist, but their application depends on who reads them and when. Formula One is a sport where the limits must be clear and where every driver must know what they can and cannot do. When sporting fairness becomes a matter of interpretation, the credibility of the spectacle falters. What happened in Mexico reflected this flaw, a system that claims to be impartial but operates with criteria that shift depending on the situation. In a statement, the FIA asserted that each incident is assessed within its context and based on the information available at the time. With that phrase, the governing body implicitly acknowledged that there is no uniform criterion. In other words, each case can have a different interpretation depending on the circumstances. This ambiguity highlighted the structural gap facing modern Formula One. The rules exist, but their application depends on who reads them and when. Formula One is a sport where the limits must be clear and where every driver must know what they can and cannot do. When sporting justice becomes a matter of interpretation, the credibility of the spectacle falters. What happened in Mexico reflected this flaw, a system that claims to be impartial but operates with criteria that shift depending on the situation. The leaks also revealed a heated discussion among the stewards about how to proceed. Some believed both drivers should receive warnings for cutting the track, while others insisted that penalizing both could generate an explosive media reaction. The FIA at that time was under scrutiny for other controversial decisions during the season and didn't want to open a new front of criticism. This media pressure became a determining factor. Punishing Verstappen, the reigning champion and central figure of the championship, would have generated a global media storm. Therefore, according to leaks, some stewards opted to apply the racing incident principle and avoid a direct penalty. In contrast, when Hamilton went off at turn 4, the narrative within the control room changed completely. The discussion was more tense and prolonged. One of the technical stewards pointed out that the Briton had ignored the designated runoff area, and that, according to the rules, he should be penalized. Another steward reminded them that this runoff area was designed for low-speed reentries, not for high-speed maneuvers like the one the Ferrari had performed. Despite the differences of opinion, external pressure began to outweigh the technical analysis. According to the recordings, the phrase that tipped the scales was uttered by one of the officials. "If we don't penalize him, it will look like favoritism towards Ferrari after the Verstappen case." That phrase sealed Hamilton's fate. The most troubling detail of the leaks was the confirmation that the teams had indirectly influenced the process. While Red Bull was pushing to close the Verstappen investigation, Ferrari was trying to understand the reasons behind the delay in reviewing Hamilton's case. Communication channels became overwhelmed, and the FIA decided to resolve the cases separately without cross-referencing arguments. This lack of internal consistency led to a double interpretation of the events. In one of the leaked audio recordings, a steward can be heard saying that if we review both incidents together, it will look like one of the two was given preferential treatment. Instead of seeking justice, they sought to protect the institution's image. The drivers also joined the conversation, albeit cautiously. Some did so openly, others more subtly. Lando Norris stated that the stewards need clear and uniform rules. George Russell declared that the lack of consistency creates distrust among everyone. These statements, which would have been unthinkable a few years ago, revealed a shift in tone within the paddock. The drivers no longer saw the FIA as an unquestionable arbiter, but rather as an entity subject to errors, pressures, and favoritism. This erosion of institutional respect was one of the most serious consequences of the scandal. The most serious consequence was the loss of credibility. For years, Formula One had tried to project a modern, technological, and transparent image. But a single weekend was enough to set back that narrative. The international community, the media, and even the sponsors began to doubt the integrity of the championship. The team stopped trusting the stewards as impartial arbiters. The fans, who formed the emotional core of the sport, felt that the competition had ceased to be a battle between drivers and had become a fight between boardrooms, politics, and vested interests. On a sporting level, the impact was devastating. Hamilton missed a historic opportunity to reach the podium with Ferrari, while Verstappen emerged stronger in points but weakened in image. The Dutchman, despite his undeniable talent, was seen by many as the beneficiary of a system that protects him. These kinds of perceptions are dangerous because they erode the narrative of merit and effort that Formula One has always championed. When the public believes that the rules are applied unequally, the result ceases to matter. What remains is the feeling that everything is rigged, and that feeling destroys the spectacle. The real lesson from Mexico is that Formula One cannot be sustained by ambiguous decisions. Sporting justice cannot depend on interpretations or pressure. It needs consistency, transparency, and accountability. If the FIA wants to regain its authority, it must demonstrate with actions that no one is above the rules. Statements and vague promises won't be enough. A structural change is needed to eliminate the discretionary power that allows these injustices. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.